Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to our third pre-conference keynote. It's Monday night, April 21st, and Bernard Bull is here. Bernard, welcome, and thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks.
Is it your birthday?
It was yesterday, but there was another big event that people were celebrating yesterday, so I thought maybe I didn't want to compete with that.
Thanks to ClassFlow for helping to support this conference. Thanks, as always, to Blackboard Collaborate for the virtual rooms. This is our first Learning Revolution conference. We're so excited about this, bringing together a lot of different worlds. You're going to hear a little bit of echo in my voice while Bernard's mic is on, but I'll be done quickly. This is where you get a chance to tell us where you're participating from. Look to the left of the map. You're looking for the star icon. Click on it twice, then click on the map. Give a shout out in the chat. While they're doing that, Bernard, you know, in many ways, this conference is designed to draw people from the different worlds. You're the most natural speaker because I feel like you bridge those worlds already to some degree. Do you feel that way?
As a person who bridges those worlds?
Yes.
I certainly spend time in many different worlds, so I hope that I'm helping to bridge some of them.
I'm an avid reader of your blog. I posted that on Twitter. I find that you touch on so many topics that I'm personally interested in and am intrigued by a lot of what you do. Look there, we've got New Zealand and Australia. Very nice. Okay, I'm going to turn the time over to you. I'm with you for the duration. You're our last event tonight, and I'll help you with the Q&A if you'd like it. But just call on me when you need me.
Great, thanks. The way I have my screen set up, I can't see the chat messages coming through very quickly. So if you don't mind, if you catch some questions along the way or comments, I'm happy to be interrupted, and we can sort of go the direction that the group wants to.
I will.
So I'll start with a video. Greetings from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm in a hotel in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the United States. I just traveled here and got here about 45 minutes in time for this event. I'm excited to spend a little bit of time with you here for the next hour. I'll turn the video off as I talk. I don't know if that makes a difference for people's bandwidth and so forth, but I'll turn it off for now. But I just wanted you to see there was a real live person behind that voice. So a little bit about this topic. I have been intrigued by topics related to alternative education and emerging models of education and other models of education that maybe aren't mainstream in terms of the schooling systems. I spent a lot of time studying and visiting different types of schools and different models. And a transformational experience for me happened a number of years ago. It was around the time my daughter was born, maybe a little bit after that. And I visited a project-based learning school here in Wisconsin. It was the first project-based learning school I'd ever visited. It's a very different model from a typical high school that you might imagine. There was only one required class, and it was a class called 21st Century Skills. And in that class, the students learned about how to interview people, how to find sources when they have a driving question that they want to find answers to. They learned about how to organize their time and time management and keep track of their field notes. They learned about some etiquette related to working out in the community. And it was an intriguing course, but the rest of the students' experience was largely self-directed. The students were able to choose topics of personal interest, and they had learning coaches in the schools that would work with them and help them to make sure that they aligned to the state standards and things that were required, because this was a public school. And I was intrigued by the fact that I remembered in my own childhood that there were these memorable projects that I worked on, these highlights of my learning experience, things that I remember 20, 30 years after they happened. But what seemed to be so intriguing to me was that those memorable types of experiences seemed to be happening on a daily basis for these students. that they seemed so immersed in these questions that they had created and their pursuit of answers to those questions. And that began a journey for me where I started looking at different models of what we're calling here self-directed learning. Experiences where learners are taking the responsibility for their own learning. And they're also developing competence and confidence in learning things on their own. And that's what I'd like to spend a little bit of time with you exploring today for the next 45 minutes or hour, or however much time we choose to spend here. So to get going, I always like to have a little bit of audience participation, and I like to choose this statement because it can be read in so many different ways. It could be offensive to some people. It could be engaging to others. It just has different meanings depending upon how you emphasize different terms and the context that you place the sentence in. So to get us going here, I'm curious from the group, how many of you would say true to the statement, good teachers become less important? And how many of you would say false? Now, keep in mind, this is a really ambiguous question. You might want some clarification before I ask you, but I'm not going to give you any. I just want your first gut reaction. As you read this statement, to what extent does it resonate with you? You say, yeah, this is true. And to what extent doesn't it resonate? You might say false. You can type in the chat box if you like, and just type your message that way. We don't have the poll system up here for you right now. I can't see if we're getting any responses. Do you see any messages being sent, Steve?
Yeah, you're getting a pretty even mix between true and false. Let's see, I know you don't want comments at this point, but I would say it's close to 50-50, maybe even a little bit more false.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting, and it always depends upon the group. I present to a wide variety of audiences. I present to, for example, more recently I was presenting at an Innovative Schools Network conference where these are leaders of Montessori schools and Waldorf schools and ProjectBased and self-directed schools, and they certainly had one take on this. I also use this quote sometimes as a discussion starter with more traditional schools, and they often choose false because they read it as saying, well, good teachers will never be less important. They're always important. And so really the statement is both true and false, most of us would argue, and it depends upon how we define teachers, how we define good, and how we define less important. For me, this is a title of a blog post, one of the most popular blog posts that I've written in the last couple of years, largely because it's such a debatable statement. My intent behind the statement originally was making the point that the best teachers enable learners to learn without a teacher. In other words, the best teachers help learners make this progress so that they reach a point where they can learn even when there isn't a teacher directing them. They move from a teacher-directed to more of a learner-directed kind of experience of learning. So let's take another sort of discussion starter. This is one, and this is a metaphor that people use. Sometimes they'll show an image like this of past classrooms and point out how it seems to resonate with a factory model of education. But as we think about education historically, there are different models. If we look around the world, we see much more variety. But if we look at sort of the Western world and the influences of education over the last 150 years, this is a really familiar look to a classroom. And if we walk into such classrooms, we might see one teacher presenting the same content to all the students at the same time. And the teacher's choosing the time, pace, place, and path of the learning experience. And what I'm going to propose as we have our conversation together is that there are other possibilities. For example, even in this classroom, there's a door somewhere. We don't know where the door is. It's off, it's behind the camera somewhere. But if all the students had to get out of the room at the same time, they would not all choose the same pathway. The student in the back corner would have to go a different route than the student in the bottom right here up front. It's common sense to us because they're in different places. They'll have to take different pathways to get to the door. What's so interesting, though, is that in many of our educational institutions, we seem to have lost recognition of the fact that that's what happens for learners as well. The fact that they have to go different ways to get to the same destination, that's the same thing when it comes to learning things. And each learner may have to take a different path. A different path is going to be better for each learner. Because you've never seen a classroom where every learner is sitting in the same seat in the same desk. In the same way, there is no classroom where every learner is in the same place in terms of their interest and their motivation and their prior knowledge and the things they've learned. And that's calling us today as we're having this really exciting learning revolution as people are experimenting and discovering the possibilities of each learner having personalized pathways, and even giving the learners opportunity or inviting the learners to take opportunity to direct their own learning. All right. I know I have long introductions. I apologize, but I think it's so important just to kind of prime our thoughts, our thinking, our conversation. These are two images, and sometimes I use these two images with groups of people, and I'll ask them if they're teachers, for example. I'll say, which image best represents your learning environment? Or if you think about your own life and your own learning experience, which image best represents it? The one on the left is supposed to be a fish market. There are people that are behind the counter that are serving fish, and people on the left are people are ordering fish, and the others are picking it out and packaging it and delivering it to them. On the right, we have a picture of what looks like a father and his son or a young boy, and you can't see it very well in this image, but there's a fishing rod. And the father is sort of guiding the boy, but the boy is doing the fishing. So this comes back, of course, to that metaphor that, it's maybe even cliche to some people. You can give a man a fish, he'll have fish for a day. You can teach a man to fish, he'll have fish for a lifetime. And we can use that in a really powerful way to think about learning environments and learning experiences. To what extent are the majority of schools fish markets? And to what extent are they places of fishing lessons? Places where people aren't necessarily always just delivered the content or the learning, but they're guided in how to gain that content or how to learn a skill or new knowledge on their own. And this is really where I'd like to guide us as we think about this topic today. I truly believe that this is one of the most critical 21st century skills of our era. The other image, and I think this is my last hook or introduction, is a picture of a stage. And let's imagine that there's a play taking place on this stage. If so, there are a number of possibilities. My question, though, is as you think about learning, where do you usually put the learner? Is the learner the one who's sitting in the audience watching things happen? Is the learner the one who is on the stage participating, actually making, actually performing in the play? Or is the learner the one who's behind the stage, who's helping kind of get things together? Or is it possible that the learner is the one who wrote the play in the first place? So each of those are significantly different roles. And I would argue that in our lives as learners, there is a time for us to play each and every one of those roles. But I'd argue that we would have a largely unbalanced learning experience if we only experience one of those perspectives. So for example, if I go through a traditional schooling experience and 90% of my experience is watching things that are presented to me, there's a lot that I'm missing out on. But what if I actually get engaged and I'm actually doing some of the performing, and others are learning or benefiting from what I'm doing, and I'm benefiting along the way? Or what if I'm actually the one who's directing the play at times, or directing the learning, or if I'm actually writing the learning plan itself, or I'm doing the behind-the-scenes work. You get the idea. It's kind of a fun metaphor to play around with. If you have a group of people interested in education topics, it can be a really nice, provocative one. I'm going to skip this one for now, but no, I won't. So Carolyn Dweck I love her book, Mindset, and she's written some other things about mindset. Many of you are probably familiar with it, but she has this concept of a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And the fixed mindset is oftentimes the person who approaches a new experience or a particular topic in school, for example, and they approach it by saying, you know, I'm good at math or I'm not good at math. And it's oftentimes that fixed mindset, you just believe that you have certain innate abilities and certain things that you're not so good at. And that's just how it is. So those who are good at math will thrive in math class, and those who aren't good at math won't thrive. But a growth mindset, as Dweck represents it, is significantly different. For a growth mindset, it's a person who may recognize the fact that they don't seem to learn math as quickly as the person next to them. But given adequate time and effort and strategies, they know that they will learn more about math with that effort and time and strategy than if they just sat there. They have this mindset that I can grow, I can become better than I am now with time and practice. I just need to grow in my competence and confidence. The fixed mindset, on the other hand, oftentimes just sort of sees themselves as stuck. You're just there. Well, I'm going to suggest that self-directed learning is the journey of encouraging people to embrace a growth mindset in their lives. This one is an image that represents the idea of a personal learning network, because this really brings us into the concept of the digital age. A personal learning network, as many of you know, is this network. It's whatever groups or people or resources you use to learn throughout your life. And we all have a personal learning network. It may consist of your local library, the websites and web resources that you frequent, the people with whom you connect, and the people you learn from. All of that makes up our personal learning network. And I would like to suggest that part of growing as a self-directed learner is helping each person develop that personal learning network, inviting them to consider the concept of a personal learning network and to develop it, and to see that as something that they will be developing their entire lives. They'll be clipping off, or pruning their network at times. Other times they'll be expanding it, depending upon their goals and their needs at different times and situations in their lives. So as we go forward, I've put together, I've pulled a definition of self-directed learning from the website listed here, selfdirectedlearning.com, that I think really connects. You'll notice that there is a difference. If you start looking around, people have different meanings for self-determined and self-directed learning, and I'm not going to go into a lot of those nuances right now. But here, the individual takes the initiative and the responsibility for what occurs. Individuals select, manage, and assess their own learning activities. So this is a really hands-on, learner-centered approach to learning. Now, in the digital world, I also take the idea of blended learning, which is where you take the best of online and the best of face-to-face experiences, and I combine it with self-directed learning. And I suggest that we call that self-blended learning. It's really self-directed learning that leverages the power of the web and emerging tools and technologies available to us today. One last concept as I'm just preparing us for the 8 laws here is this idea of capable people. And this comes, you'll find a growing group of people who are interested in something that's an alternative to what we call pedagogy, which is called heutagogy. And heutagogy would be self-determined learning. And there's a quote from this article here about capable people that I think is really powerful. It says, "The world has no place for the inflexible, the unprepared, and the ostrich with head in the sand." And this applies to organizations as well as individuals. And the article goes on and has some really neat points about this. But part of the vision behind self-directed learning is helping people grow in competence and confidence, helping them grow as capable people. people who feel like they are capable of accomplishing things on their own. There's some really interesting conversations about self-directed learning that are happening, and one of the popular ones, it was a TED Talk that gained a lot of attention, and then a book called The First 20 Hours by Josh Kaufman, where he points out the fact that schools don't really teach skills that well. They often teach a lot of knowledge. But in his book, Josh Kaufman actually goes through and he learns to play the ukulele. And he points out that he calls it an ukulele because that's the pronunciation of the origin of instruments as opposed to the ukulele. He learns to use what was it, a sailboard? What's it called? I'm sorry, you know, a surfboard with a sail. What's that called?
I have no idea.
Someone tell me type it. Yeah, me either. I've never tried it before, but he did clearly, and he did it in under 20 hours. One of the things he pointed out is there you go. Windsurfing was what he wanted to learn. And he picked a number of different tasks or skills that he wanted to learn. And he points out that the 10,000-hour rule of becoming an expert, he says he acknowledges the fact that it may require someone 10,000 or more hours to become an expert. But it only takes about 20 hours to get enough skill where you can sort of enjoy and appreciate many things. Not everything, but many things. And he proposes a 3-step process for the self-directed learner. One is figure out the skill that you want to learn and then break it down into the pieces that you might want to practice. So if any of you played a sport, I, for example, played basketball. Outside of the game, sometimes we broke up the game into discrete areas that we wanted to practice, like free throws or practicing your defense or offense. And he proposes that that's a first step. A second is to gain enough knowledge so that you can correct yourself as you're practicing, so that you can get sort of the feedback that you need to learn. And then to get rid of any barriers to learning, oftentimes psychological barriers to learning, and get those out of the way. And he argues that when you do these 3 things, you can learn a surprising amount, especially in terms of skill acquisition, in a very short period of time. It's an interesting book that I've enjoyed. I actually am listening to it now after having read it a couple times. But it's an interesting book because it helps us think about the power of self-directed learning. Another organization that's near and dear to my heart is 4-H. For those of you who are not in the United States, 4-H is an organization that allows, where young people, historically, people thought of it as something that happened mostly in rural communities. But you could learn about all sorts of things, and young people could gain skill in everything from baking to making clothing to raising cattle or hogs or different kinds of livestock, and there would be competitions about growing different foods, all sorts of things. And kids, when they sign up for 4-H, they can choose topics of interest. For example, last year, my daughter signed up for a 4-H group that learned to do different kinds of art projects, and she made mosaics. And there's one really rare topic, though. There are lots of groups. If you look at 4-H materials, there are hundreds of different groups depending upon where you live in the United States and what's available at your local 4-H group. But there's one that's less known, and it's called the 4-H SelfDetermined Project. And it's kind of neat because it breaks up this idea of self-determined learning, and students can choose, or young people can choose to work on a project of interest. And these are not the words of the 4-H materials. I just sort of summarized it with these 5 points. I have a blog post below if you want to read about this. If you want, you could just go to Google and type detail and then 4-H, and I think it'll be the first article to show up. There's actually a link, like if you were working with young people, there's a little sort of worksheet or guide of questions that students can work through when they're developing their own projects. So basically it walks you through these steps. Decide what you want to do for your project or what you want to learn. Develop a plan for how you want to do it. Determine what kind of help do you need. And usually you have a 4-H leader, but then you pick a helper who has some expertise in your area of interest. Design a means of documenting your progress so you can kind of document how you're progressing. And then share what you did with other people along the way. It's such a simple 5-step process, but that can be a transformational experience for a young person who maybe has never had a chance to do this. In fact, I use the 4-H guide. I use these 5 steps in some of my own projects. Now, I'm finally getting to the point of the title of this presentation. John Milton Gregory, in 1888, he was in the United States, in the state of Michigan. He was, I believe, the director of education, or whatever that title is, the state superintendent of schools. That's what it was, in the state of Michigan for a time. He was also a minister. And he wrote this very short book that some of you may have come across at some point, called The 7 Laws of Teaching. And I was reading this, I read it actually every year. It's just certain old books that I enjoy revisiting once a year, and this one takes you about an hour to read. And I was reading it, but at this time I'd been also doing more study about self-directed learning. And so as I was going through his laws, I decided to kind of rewrite them and think about them from a self-directed learner's perspective. Here are the laws as they stand. A teacher must be the one who knows the lesson or truth to be taught. A learner is the one who attends with interest to the lesson given. 3, the language used as a medium between teacher and learner must be common to both. 4, the lesson to be learned must be you must be able to explain it in terms of truth already known by the learner. So there has to be that, that common, that has to be understandable. Teaching is the act of arousing and using a student's mind to form it in a desired conception or thought. Now, as you look at these, this is really the laws of teaching. This is a strongly teacher-centered set of laws. In essence, it assumes that a great learning experience requires a teacher to direct it, or at least that's how the laws are written. And then the last 2 are: learning is thinking into one's own understanding a new idea or truth, re-knowing and reproducing of the knowledge taught. This is where I thought it was interesting, because even in a very teacher-centric set of laws, John Milton Gregory in 1888 recognized that learning is thinking into one's own understanding a new idea or truth, that there is no learning apart from the action of the learner. And I think I wrote a blog post this year as I was musing on this point. The only essential attribute of a learning experience, the only essential participant in a learning experience is a learner. Without a learner, learning can't happen. That's where the magic happens. It happens within the learner. And number 7, the test and proof of teaching done, the finishing and fastening process he talks about. It must be a reviewing, a rethinking, a re-knowing, and a reproducing of the knowledge taught. So he points out that if something isn't sort of used, it's lost. So using this model, I propose the 8 laws of the self-directed learner. Now, the law of the teacher, that was sort of based on the 7 that I just shared before, it was pretty teacher-centered, and it argued that the teacher has to be really knowledgeable and know their stuff. If the teacher doesn't know their stuff, the learners won't learn. But from a self-directed learning standpoint, the law of the teacher says everyone, including the self and everything, is a teacher. So here we expand the concept of teacher to mean a resource, a person, a dozen people, 100 or 1,000 people in one's lives. A teacher is anything that gives me opportunity to learn. So any resource, human or otherwise, becomes a teacher from the perspective of a self-directed learner. This may seem kind of self-explanatory, but it's such a critical point, a discovery for self-directed learners. As a person discovers the fact that I am able to find teachers all around me. Every one of us have walked past 100 or even 1,000 teachers if we think about it from this perspective. Every person that we've walked past, every resource that we've had available to us on the web is a possible teacher for a self-directed learner. The law of the lesson. So from the 7 laws of teaching, the focus was largely on a teacher crafting a solid lesson that a learner could benefit, from which a learner could benefit. But here, from a self-directed learner's perspective, the law of the lesson says that a self-directed learner establishes the learning goals and attends to pursuing and achieving that goal. So in other words, the learner is not only one who benefits from the lesson, the learner is the one who crafts, who constructs the lesson. And both constructing the lesson is a learning experience, but then actually using it to learn becomes a powerful learning experience. The third one is the law of language. So one of the things that was pointed out in the 7 laws of teaching was that there needed to be a language, a common language that was spoken between teacher and student. But the reality is that language plays an even bigger role as we learn anything. Anytime we go to learn a new skill, or we learn about a new discipline, or we have goals that we want to achieve, there's usually a vocabulary around that, and there's even a conversation around it. And maybe people talked about it before. We can sometimes refer to those as discourses. So in the field of education, I'm intrigued by the topic of self-directed learning. Well, there is an existing discourse that's much bigger than myself on the topic of self-directed learning. That's a conversation that's been happening for a very long time. And as I desire to learn more about the topic of self-directed learning, I tap into those existing discourses, and I start to learn the vocabulary. I start to learn the language. And this has been pointed out by Jim G. as he looks at video games and this idea that playing a video game, you're learning a language and a discourse within every game. And so gaming itself becomes an opportunity to learn how to learn discourses and languages. Well, this is true for any learning experience, and so the self-directed learner begins to discover this fact, this power of language and discourse in their lives. And they use that then, and so they discover that as they want to learn something new that they're unfamiliar with, an early step is to start to get familiar with the language. If you think about some of your favorite hobbies, that's much of what we learned. I was a marathoner for a number of years. And I remember early on, even as I learned to run and I strengthened my body for the tasks, I also was learning a new language. And I learned about the different technologies available and the ways that we talked about running and the different terms and phrases that were popular. And what is a marathon? Is it to know that it's 26.2 miles and a half marathon 13.1 and a 5K is 5.1, or 3.1 miles and things like that. That was a whole discourse and a vocabulary that I didn't know previously. And the self-directed learner begins to discover that and leverage it for learning. The fourth is the law of bridges. And the law of bridges argues that self-directed learner builds brain bridges between what the learner knows and can do and what the learner aspires to know. So in the law of teaching, it says that the teacher helps build on prior knowledge. Everyone has past experiences and beliefs and ideas that they bring to a given lesson, and the teacher leverages that past to help the learners to learn new things, sometimes by using analogies and examples. The self-directed learner acknowledges the same thing and learns to get to know himself or herself and what she already knows and she can do, and figures out how to leverage that past knowledge and skill in order to acquire new knowledge and skill. And as the knowledge and skill grows, they become more capable of learning even more. The fifth one is the self-directed learner aspires to learn how to motivate herself or himself and what motivates. So from a teaching standpoint, it's often how do I get the learners motivated? How do I motivate those students who would rather be somewhere else? But from the perspective of the self-directed learner, the self-directed learner sees him or herself as a whole person who's often motivated and sometimes unmotivated. And sometimes there are goals that the self-directed learner has, but the goals aren't necessarily easy to achieve, and there will be times where they feel not very motivated to persist. And so part of the task of the self-directed learner is to get to know that about him or herself, to know what motivates himself, know what sort of disenfranchises. And so there's a self-discovery process that begins to happen with self-directed learners as they come to discover, what are these things that really keep me going, and what are the roadblocks, and how do I work around them, and what are the best strategies that I use to work around them. So when you go to examples, for example, learning communities of self-directed learners, there are oftentimes sort of these show and tell type of experiences where the self-directed learners gather with other self-directed learners, and they each share about what they're learning and how they're learning it. And they give each other tips and ideas on how they overcome different challenges. It's like show and tell for older kids in some cases, including older kids like myself. The sixth one is the law of re, which would be the self-directed learner reviews, refines, and recreates what she learns. And so this is that law of, if we learn something once but we don't use it, we don't continue to review it or make it an integrated part of our lives, it will likely just sort of fade to the point where we can hardly even remember it. I sometimes like the analogy, if you picture like an old chalkboard and you write the word memory on it, and you take an eraser and you lightly slide it across the word, it'll be a little less clear on the board. And you do it once more, a little less clear, once more, a little less clear, until finally you can hardly tell that the word memory was ever written on the board. And that's what often happens with a learning experience that's not reviewed, refined, or continually sort of recreated. The seventh one is the self-directed learner establishes authentic feedback loops that help monitor progress. In other words, the self-directed learner recognizes the fact that they need to know how they're doing at some point, and say, and so in many traditional environments, maybe the teacher sees it as his or her job to give the learner feedback. But from the self-directed learner's perspective, the learner's job is to ask, how am I doing? And to find people and resources to help. I had an image, I don't think I put it in here, but one image that I sometimes use to illustrate this point is, I'll give you the scenario. Imagine that I have an important meeting tomorrow morning. And so I wake up in the morning and I realize that my alarm clock did not go off and I'm running late. I'm rushed, so I quickly put on my clothes. I run out the door and I run to my car. I drive to my office, and my meeting is actually going to be a web conference with several people that I've been really excited to meet with. And I turn on my webcam and I discover that my hair is sticking straight up. In my rush to get to the office, I forgot to even run a comb through it. And it's just looking, I'm looking pretty disheveled and I'm embarrassed. So I quickly sort of push my hair down and maybe run to the restroom and pat a little water on it and get a little more presentable, and then I start the meeting. That web camera played a critical role as a feedback loop. It told me how I was doing and how I looked at that moment. And so the self-directed learner also seeks to figure out what are those feedback loops that I need to discover that can help me know how I'm doing. Am I getting closer to my goal or further away? And so the learner may choose to use experts, may come up with maybe checklists of things to kind of sort of to self-evaluate, may choose peers to give some feedback. They may have some kind of computer-generated feedback. There are lots of opportunities. And then we have the law of application. So the law of application says the self-directed learner strives to embody the new knowledge or skill. So this is the step where the self-directed learner chooses to own what they've learned. This is, and how will I use this? Now, I take a particular perspective on this because my perspective on self-directed learning is that it's not only about serving myself as a learner. So I'll tell you a quick story. There was a man in college in the 1950s, or I can't remember actually the dates, but during his time in college, he was really troubled by a number of things and really intrigued by a number of things. He was a musician. He had a deep heart for young people and wanted to benefit their lives somehow. He was a deeply religious person who believed in the concept of loving your neighbor, and so he wanted to figure out how to spend his life loving his neighbor. He was also troubled by this growing technology called the television and how it was being used to take advantage of young people from his perspective. And he felt like we needed more wholesome, beneficial programming for children. Now, if you imagine those three areas, his love for children, his concern about television, and his interest in figuring out how to live his life and love to his neighbor, if you picture those as a Venn diagram, right in the middle, you will have Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Fred Rogers ran for those of you who don't know of Fred Rogers, he had a very, very popular children's television show that treated people as students as very authentic human beings, and he didn't talk down to them, and he took them on these little learning journeys, and it was a very powerful, long-standing television show. That's an example of a self-directed learner, Fred Rogers, embodying his new knowledge or skill. He took these things that he wanted to learn more about, and he got really good at them, and he used them to benefit other people. And that's sort of the pinnacle of self-directed learning. And I say this, and I like to finish on the law of application, because self-directed learning isn't selfish directed learning. It's the learner is taking ownership for their learning, but the benefit, those who benefit from it may be widespread. So I tried to finish in the bulk of my presentation here in a little under 45 minutes. And I know we have up to an hour, so I'm hoping that we can have some rich conversation about this. I'm going to put a slide up. Another way to represent the 8 laws that I presented here, I sort of condensed a couple of them, is we can do them in the form of questions. So what I'm suggesting is a self-directed learner learns to ask these 7 questions. What do I need or want to learn? Who or what will be my teachers? How will I use what I already know to learn what I want to? How will I know when I've learned it? How will I monitor my progress? How am I going to stay motivated? How am I going to make my learning deep and lasting? So with those kind of concluding questions, I'd like to open it up for comments and questions. And Steve, if you are willing to help moderate, I hope we can have a nice, lively chat here.
That was terrific. Okay, we've had a good response in the chat. Nothing that I think I need to bring up right away, but other people will indicate either in the chat or by raising their hand if you would like to ask a question. I'm going to start with asking about 2 specific areas. And Ben wants the last slide again, which I agree with. Can we go back to that previous slide? Perfect. Okay, so there are 2 pieces here that I wasn't sure were in the 8 points. Now there are 7 questions. I'm in the 8 points, but maybe you can help me figure out where they fit in. One would be this question of being willing to take risks, right? And actually, I'll combine the 2 into one. And that's the balancing of independent thinking with social pressure to think as others do. How does that fit into your framework here? And Bernard, I think your mic may be off.
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Thanks. So one way I might think about this would be confidence building and competence building. And I think that your question of risk-taking often ties to that confidence and the willingness. And oftentimes as we grow in competence, it also helps us gain new confidence. I think in terms of where it fits in the laws, we could say that sort of the risk-taking shows up in terms of the first law as I presented the law of the learner. As one is establishing goals that they want to achieve. But I'm thinking about it, even as you ask that question, that might be worth a 9th law. I mean, just to make it even more transparent. So I would put it under maybe that first law. And then also, I mean, as I think about it myself, I put it under this tool for kind of monitoring progress. Let me just go back and see how I had it phrased a little bit earlier here.
Because sometimes the feedback that you get, you actually have to learn to ignore.
Right, yeah. No, that makes good sense. I think that's a really valid point.
Okay, so we've got Kate
Yeah,
and Liz. Go ahead.
That's a great point. I think that it might be worth actually adding a new law.
I'll take some modest credit for that if you do. I'll feel good about it. Kate says, yes, risk-taking is an important 21st century attribute, learning from mistakes. Dan mentioned motivation and sharing your knowledge with others.
Was there a question?
No, I think that was a comment. But I guess that would be my question would be, where is the sharing of knowledge with others and sort of the creation process?
Right. Where does it fit in terms of these laws?
Correct.
Right. So I think that would be the way that I sort of represent them is under, it would show up in both the 8th law of embodying the new skill, but also this idea of sort of reviewing, refining, and recreating as part of the learning experience. So for example, let's pick something like a self-directed learner who desires to learn to play the guitar. So oftentimes in the process of learning to play the guitar, some people do learn to play it right away by composing their own songs from the beginning. But oftentimes they may pick songs from others that they learned and they practice, and they develop some of their own sort of style and their own skill along the way, and there's a creative process. Oftentimes, though, for some skills, they learn and they develop a competence and a confidence, and the more that grows, then they start getting into the sort of level 6 and level 8, where they recreate, they review, they refine, and they start creating new knowledge, and they start creating sort of new pathways that maybe hadn't been used by others who learned the same skill. But I think that's going to vary based upon the learning goal, too.
We're getting some other good comments here. Brad says he came in late, so we may have already covered this part. How do we need to teach or model the students to become self-directed learners? Is it simply about setting the learning culture, or should we be teaching the skill? And I actually think that that's a really good question, even, Brad, without having seen the full presentation, because clearly these laws then lead to a set of conclusions about what a teacher does.
I agree. So I would argue that it depends a lot upon an individual learning community and learning organization. I think visiting so many diverse learning organizations over the last years, I'm a little more cautious to argue that there's one way to do it. But some of the more inspirational examples that I've seen, there are different models. I've seen, for example, some schools that explicitly teach these, that they make this sort of an integrated part of their formal curriculum, and they teach it as a new content area, in essence, like a new subject. And so it's really one class is essentially learning how to learn, or it's integrated into units in different classes. And it would be walking learners through, first of all, just kind of developing awareness of these different laws, or guiding students to ask these kinds of questions. So that certainly is one strategy that I've seen schools take, and it's worked well for them, and they've found success. And in some ways, they've become sort of hybrid schools of teacher-directed, learner-directed. Other schools, in terms of more traditional schooling environments I've seen, take much more of a learning coach approach to this. And maybe they do have some explicit teaching up front, but they oftentimes start by just introducing a question at a time. And maybe the first question is, what do you want or need to learn? And as they and then they sort of coach and guide students through the process of asking these other questions. So it's more organic and conversational as it emerges. Most of the schools that I've seen, though, do tend to build a shared vocabulary in the learning community. So they have a common way of talking about what they're experiencing as the different learners are becoming more and more self-directed. And they have buzzwords. And that becomes really powerful because they can use a single word and everyone else in the community just sort of resonates with it instantly. And I'm sure that all of us in this room have had that happen at some point in our lives.
So Kate wants to know, where would communities of practice fall?
So communities of practice, I would see as oftentimes fitting under this the idea that everything and everyone is a teacher. Communities of practice seem to be really powerful communities for people to leverage a large number of teachers around a common or shared goal. And in fact, the participant is sometimes the teacher and sometimes benefiting from many other teachers. I think that's, and I've thought about that one quite a bit too, as I've looked at different representations of communities of practice online, and that seems to be how many of them play out. But as many of you have seen, communities of practice have many different styles, so sometimes they can be still a little more authoritarian, where there's a very experienced practitioner who sort of dominates the conversation. My wife and I were having this conversation recently. She's working on her PhD in language and literacy, and she's very interested in these kinds of online communities. And she was noticing that, for example, she's very interested in cooking and baking, and on some of these communities of practice around those topics, there are a handful of very powerful, influential people who sort of dominate the role of teacher, and others sort of learn from them. But I think of communities of practice very much as sort of communities of co-learners who leverage one another as teachers.
So one of the things that I do consciously as someone, I consider myself to be a self-directed learner. One of the things I consciously do is I engage in conversations with people where I know the conversation itself will help to teach me. Not just the person, but knowing that I can have a certain kind of conversation that will prompt my own thinking and require me to verbalize ideas and get feedback. Does that extend beyond number two, or is it part of number two?
Well, I think the purpose of the laws are to get us thinking about this and talking about it. And I know that there's that Buddhist proverb of taking a raft across the river, but once you get across the river, you don't really need the raft anymore, and you can just let it go, and you go on your own journey. I guess I would approach the laws that way. So I wouldn't worry too much about where it fits or doesn't fit, but just for people who are starting out and beginning to explore, maybe they just want a common vocabulary for self-directed learning, this can be a good start. But I don't know. I mean, as I hear your example, I would think that I might attach it to law number two in some ways. In other ways, though, I might tie it to my understanding of number five, as I leverage other people as sort of resources for feedback. But still another person might actually think of it as thinking about staying motivated. And I know that through conversation, I stay more engaged and motivated. So yeah, I think I approach this a little bit more organically. And I know people who want to really precise laws might be uncomfortable with that. But I tend to be more of a global thinker about these things.
Yeah, I guess my question was, is it missing? Meaning, for me, conversation is such a huge part of self-directed learning, the social learning aspect, that I guess I would have to decide for myself, is it an additional point I would call out, or does it, for me, fit within the concept of teachers? There are 7 questions here, but there were 8 laws, and I'm not able to look easily enough at the 2 and compare. Is there one left out?
Well, yeah, so the 7 questions, a couple of these, and this is the part that maybe makes it a little messy for people, I apologize, is that these questions are pulled from the different laws, but they're not directly tied to each one. Some of them are directly tied, but others kind of cross over a little bit. So it's just sort of another way of thinking about it. So I should probably have had a nice ending slide to have just the laws listed together. It would have been clearer.
It occurs to me also that a lot of people I know who practice Socratic classroom environments would probably agree with a lot of this. Would that be your impression as well?
Well, that's interesting. So Socratic, as I think about it, there's usually a teacher that's directing much of the conversation with traditional Socratic methodology. So I might look at that as a little bit different. Certainly many of these concepts are being leveraged in different ways. But I think a self-directed learning perspective, at least the discourse around self-directed learning, tends to have individual learners often establishing the goals, sort of the end destination. They're more involved in deciding where they want to end up. Whereas Socratic, as I understand it, tends to be sort of a teacher guiding one or more learners toward a shared destination.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to hear Michael Strong, who's our closing keynote speaker, who's used the Socratic method himself quite extensively. I'm thinking he's actually very close to you, although I'm not a good one to parse what exactly it means to be a Socratic teacher. If Julie wonders what one of the two was called, Julie, there's a little secret here, which is that you can go to File, Save, and you can actually save the whiteboard. Make sure you save it as a PDF, and you can look at this later. And then Brad wants to know, can true self-directed learning occur with a defined syllabus to cover?
Right. So that's certainly the balance that we have between teacher-directed learning communities and self-directed learning communities. So many schools, as we know them today, are set up as largely teacher-directed learning communities. And we even have in many public schools and things like that, we have some expectations. And there's certainly a place for teacher-directed. But I think there's room for self-directed learning to happen in more traditional teacher-directed environments. But no, in many cases, if it were a fully self-directed learning environment, the syllabus might not be covered. So here's how some schools are dealing with that as we look at like project-based learning schools. One way that they do it is that they give the learners an immense amount of freedom to choose when that time, place, pace, and path, and even what they want to learn and what they want to explore. And a learning coach works alongside them and says, well, we do have these sort of goals, these common goals or outcomes that we all have to reach as part of this class or part of this year, or maybe a high school student as part of your high school career. And so how can we weave these into your projects? And so that teacher or coach, so it starts with the learner's goal, and then the teacher or coach helps make sure that they add the sort of required components or elements.
So I lost Bernard's audio. It looks like others did as well. I think that's probably a hotel internet connection. We'll pop back in just a second. But we are at the end of the hour anyway. And he should hear this sped up for him as it catches up. But I'm going to clap for him. I do not believe that this is an ebook format or that he has the document anywhere. But again, I think you can download the slides, go to File, Save, and save the whiteboard as a PDF file. And I would imagine you can also reach out to Bernard and correspond with him. And my guess is, I think this is actually based on a blog post, so it may be up there. And he has dropped out of the session, which I'm guessing means his connection dropped. So that was really delightful. He's not going to get to hear this, these compliments of him, but I think we'll go ahead and close, and I'll show that contact slide again. And once you're done, I'm going to turn the recording off. Once you are done, you can exit the room, and it will help us to process the recording. Everyone has to be out of the room for that to happen, but the recording will be up within about half an hour. And as well, you can also download the slides during the recording, so if you miss them at this point, you can get them later. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for attending tonight. Take care, and bye now.